Shabbat Shalom for those of you who are on YouTube. I have missed speaking to you all. We've had a few Sabbaths where I wasn't able to come to you, or maybe at least it was one, I don't know. Anyways, I am happy to be back. I'm looking forward to this message, and we are going to get started. So, let's start at the very beginning. What have we learned so far in this Torah cycle? Let's talk a minute about Torah cycle. For those of you who are new, a Torah cycle is basically a cycle from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, or what we call Bereshit, which is the very, very, very beginning of the scroll, until the end of the scroll. My scroll camera is broken right now. We're going to get a replacement. But when that happens, you will be able to see the scroll again. So I'm not going to touch too much on the scroll because we don't have the camera. But the principle is that the fat part of the scroll becomes the skinny part of the scroll, right? And as it rolls. And so there's this idea of a greater and a lesser. There's this idea of a teacher within Torah. Why? Because Yahweh, so Aaron and Miriam are sitting together gossiping about Moses, right? And this Cushite woman whom he married. And basically what happens is Yahweh approaches them and says, you two come to the tent of meeting. So they go to the tent of meeting. And of course, Moses goes to the tent of meeting and he says, when I'm dealing with a prophet, I speak to them through visions and dreams. And of course, we know that that's the Na'um, right? The place in between asleep and awake where we have the theta waves being produced by the pineal gland being part of the kind of the cosmic metaphysical process of spirituality within the human. Okay. Lots of speculation there, lots of arguments that could be made, but the point is that in general, he says, this is how I speak to my prophets. But then he says, not so for my servant Moses, we speak mouth to mouth. And the principle is that as Yahweh spoke, Moses' mouth spoke, and they were in echad, they were in direct connection to each other. And when that was going on, he was writing down what he spoke, okay? And so not channeling, not an avatar, not a puppet. Moses wasn't a puppet who Yahweh would just move his mouth. They were in direct connection with each other. And so as Yahweh spoke, he spoke, right? As Moses spoke, Yahweh spoke. They were echad, all right? Now, there's a few reasons why that's important, but the biggest one is that Torah is not written down by man in man's opinion and the constructs of his mind about what actually happened. What do I mean by that? I mean, like when we're in Revelation and you got a demon with a scorpion tail and women's hair and yellow chest plate, it probably wasn't those things. It was a human construct, our brains constructing, our imaginations constructing what we think we see when we can't explain it because we have no frame of reference. For example, if I look at my bookcase, I know it's a bookcase, right? If I look at my desk, I know it's a desk. If I look at the table, I know it's a table. There's probably 15 different ways to say table in my mind in different languages, right? And so the principle is that I have frames of reference. When I learned another language, I put the image of table with the word mesa, right? Or with the word tron, right? So the whole idea is that is now still a table in my brain, but does not have, it's not a dictionary where the word table and then there's an equal sign and then the word mesa. I know that that's mesa in the word Spanish. Okay, so the principle is that we have frames of reference. So when we don't have frames of reference, we create what we think it looks like. And that's a perception. That's a reality. That's a principle. Okay? All right. So what is the relevance here? The relevance here is that when Yahweh spoke to Moshe, he did not create constructs. He didn't say, I think this is what I saw, word for word, moment for moment, letter for letter dictation from Yahweh. Why is that so important? Well, because Torah distinguishes the Gentile from the Israelite believer, and Torah distinguishes the Israelite believer from the priesthood, and Torah distinguishes the priesthood from the high priest, etc., etc. Now, we also have Torah distinguishing between the wicked and the righteous, and we have the common person in between those. What does that mean? That means that no matter how you spin it, Yahweh, speaking through Moses, echad, mouth to mouth, made a distinguishment between the nations and the people. That's important because right now, in this mainstream Christianity that is present, which is an absolute dereliction of the faith, we have people calling themselves Gentile Christians. Well, that word Gentile comes from that Hebrew word goy, nations, which was a distinguishment from Israel, from his people, right? Okay. Why is that so important? Because remember, God is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And so how he distinguishes his people, he still distinguishes people now. Why is that so important? Because of his sovereignty. We're going to get to this. So let's start at the beginning. First of all, once the Torah scroll camera broke, I knew that it was probably going to happen that I would end up preaching outside the box of the parasha. That's somewhat true and somewhat not true. I'm sure you could read the parasha and see how we could tie some things in. Sure, you could read the Haftarah portion and see how we could tie some things in. And so, in principle, when we are working with this outside the box thought process, this is what we're going to do. Number one, we're going to look into parts of the scroll that we can't roll to, right? Number two, we're going to look at some of the prophecies in the prophets that we can't necessarily roll to. I mean, if you just want to take your Bible and turn to it, that's different, right? But my point is that we're going to be outside the box a little bit today. So let's start at the beginning. If we were to theologically make an adjustment on how we look at the Creator God, right? Whether you are an atheist, or you are a Christian, or you are a Muslim, or you are a Jew, or a Hindu, or something like that, there's some sort of source of creation. Now, when I say atheist, let me just propose to you that I am not speaking to atheists who don't believe in intelligent design. And let me propose to you that if you are an atheist and you don't believe in intelligent design, you're just being stubborn. Okay. So when I'm dealing with all this, what we're looking for is a source, right? We're looking for the end all beginning. And what I mean by that is nothing in between, no hiccups, no evolutions, no, just the source of all existence, right? Which of course we tie into the name Yahweh, right? And we also tie into the term God, which is a very inappropriate word for this Hebrew word, Elohim, because the word Elohim means powers, right? Powers. Whereas the word Yahweh, as not a name, but a word, a verb, communicates an infinitive existence. To exist, really, is technically what Yahweh would mean, in an infinitive form. So what we have is we have powers exist. That's Yahweh Elohim, right? Okay, so in principle, then we find that to be our source. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I think there's some sort of weird thing how creation came out of like Brahma's thigh or something like that. But the principle is there's a source, there's a beginning. In almost every single religion, there's a beginning. That beginning has with it something very interesting, and that is in its simplicity, sovereignty. So let's talk a minute about sovereignty. Sovereignty is kind of foreign to the American because we have gone through a few generations of people since we've had our homesteading. Sovereignty is very foreign to the Native Americans who were present here before the Anglo-Saxon people came here, before the Spanish came here, because they don't really understand sovereignty in the sense of an idea of there being like one king, right? It's more of a congregational tribal kind of situation, each tribe having its own leader, et cetera, which is more Israelite than it is than it is American. Okay, so the reason why this is important is because if you were alive during the American Revolution, it was the first time that there was a disassociation from sovereignty. Okay. So the best way I could understand sovereignty is to just make it as blunt and raw and uncomfortable as possible. And so if I use the word sovereignty, here's how it would be if I had sovereignty. I'm going to do what I want for as long as I want, with what I want, how I want. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's sovereignty. Sovereignty says it doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what your rights are. It doesn't matter what your impression of what you think it should be. I'll decide, and I'm going to do it my way. That's sovereignty. Now, I can tell you in the sense of jurisdiction, what is jurisdiction? Let's remember jurisdiction for a minute. Jurisdiction is where we what? Where we have a higher authority granting legal authority over another entity and giving sovereignty to that entity. Okay. So jurisdiction passes from the highest source down to some other thing, and that other thing now has sovereignty, has jurisdictional authority. What is authority? It is the permission or right to cause something or someone to move or to do something. Okay. And so when we look at authority, the way we want to think about authority is that authority is basically the force of thought that cannot be challenged. Okay, let's propose that. So when we connect sovereignty and authority together, what we have is subordination. And what is that subordination? What does subordination mean? So the whole idea is that somebody has been appointed to be underneath that authority. Case in point. Let us make man in our image. Let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over the, excuse me, over the earth, right? Okay. So in principle, then, the way that we need to think about this is in terms of the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and the earth being under Adam. Adam has been made, excuse me, a little bit lower than Elohim, that's Psalm 8. And so if Adam has been made a little lower than Elohim, and it actually doesn't say a little bit lower, it says under Elohim, then we understand that Adam has jurisdiction and has sovereignty according to the ordination of the higher authority. Okay. So in principle, then, the way that this works is the sovereign one can grant jurisdictional authority down the line, but the next one down the line can grant jurisdictional authority down the line, etc. So there's this chain of command, or this hierarchy. There's a source of all power in the universe, and as it moves downward in diminished power, not in location. Don't think space. Height, width, time is not at question here. Okay. This is a whole nother realm of dimension. Okay. So the principle is that this energy, the source of all power or energy in the universe, has a diminishing, and that diminishing then results in a subordinate energy. And that subordinate energy is subject to the sovereignty of the source. Now, in times past, we have talked a little bit about being inside of the fence of Torah or outside the fence of Torah. We've talked about the sovereignty of man. We've talked about the dominion of man as having basically the same authority of God, except for a little bit, right? Why? Why is this important? Because when we start to get into theurgy, or we start to get into metaphysics, or we start to get into the Holy Spirit, horrible translation of those words, right? We start to get into a very different kind of jurisdiction, energy, etc. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we get into the cycle of Israel, there's a diminishing and there's an increasing in authority. Yeshua says, to him who is trusted with little, he will be given much. In other words, if he's trusted with a little bit of authority, then he will be given much authority. In other words, there's an increase in authority as there's an increase in obedience. And in that process, there's an increase in what? In the ability to respond to what? To things that we would normally be reactive to. Going to get into that. Or we'd have responsibility. I don't take credit for a lot of this stuff, but I can tell you after all of my studies and my walk and my personal journey with the Father, I have encountered enhanced versions of what these are. For example, talking about responsibility, reaction versus response, and those type of things. Obviously, we have somebody who authored those things. And although they may be common to all mankind, the principle is that I don't want to pretend like I have the market cornered on this stuff. What I would like to do is just share with you the journey that it has been for me, the understanding that I have gleaned, and the confirmed experiences that have come. Okay, so obviously we've talked before about being steered like a steering wheel, right? Of being turned and directed in a certain way. So let's start at the beginning here. Let's jump on the board for a moment and let's go to let's get some information going on the board here. Okay, so at the very least, let's start with an olive. Okay, an olive. So we're just going to go draw ourselves an olive. I apologize for my Hebrew. I know that it is not necessarily all that great. Now we have Aleph, right? We're going to go ahead and put a mem in here. Okay. And then, of course, a tav. All right. So this, of course, is the Hebrew word for what? This is the Hebrew word for truth. Okay. I think I'm going to go ahead and change that color so we can do some neurolinguistic stuff here with you guys' brain and compare and contrast colors. So we're going to go with truth. Whoops, that's the wrong one. There we go. Truth. This is the Hebrew word for truth. Now, contained in this is, of course, a number of things. For example, the actual parent root. Let's go green on this. The actual parent root is here. Okay. And it comes from the idea of what? Of the lead ox, right? The lead ox, and of course, water. And of course, this means strong. And this means water. And the whole idea is that this is glue, okay? This is glue. And what's interesting is the abstract of this right here is mother. Okay. So principle is that this is the word im. It means mother, but it is literally glue. Okay. And so actually, you know what? Those need to go with mother, not glue. Okay. And so the way the Hebrews thought about this is, let's chat about this a minute. So principle is that you have a tent with goat hair for the panels. And what they would do is they would overlap one panel on top of another, and glue would be applied right here. Well, how'd they make glue? Well, they would boil bones, right? They would boil bones and they would skim the stuff off the top after they had boiled the bones. And that was this viscous material that cured over time. In other words, as it dried, it became very, very strong. And so that became a waterproofing material. And that's the panels of the tent would be overlaid over each other. And that glue would create a seal, right? So they believed that that was the best illustration of the mother holding the tent together. Okay. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the word truth, the word faith, the word faithfulness, the word belief, the word the word trust all have an origin. Well, not necessarily the word trust, but trustworthiness definitely has its origins in the glue or in the mother or in the steadfast holding strength of the glue. Okay. Okay. In contrast, of course, we have what? We have Av, which is what? The strength of the tent, which was the middle supporting pole that held up the entire tent. Now, the relevance of this is going to come from the fact that even though that is the parent root, I want to show you something. So remember, truth is coming from what? It's coming from a abstract thought process of the mother, but truth is coming from glue. In other words, truth somehow holds things together. Okay. But getting back to our word emet, let me go ahead and erase that one there. Okay. Getting back to the word emet, we have something interesting that happens, and this is very powerful thought process. Okay. I am just going to erase one letter from this list, and that's the Aleph. I'm going to get rid of the lead ox. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do, I might lose a little bit of it here, but I'm going to try and see if I can't get this whole thing. I think I got it. Oh, nope, I didn't get it all. That's okay. we'll get this right here. Put where it needs to be put. Oh, no, that's not good. Here, you by yourself. Come over here. There we go. Water. All right. So the reason why I shrunk that down and I want to put it is because now we have what? We have a different parent root. I've erased the aleph, and what is this word? Well, interestingly enough, this word right here is a different parent root. By removing the aleph, this becomes what? This is the word for death. Boy, that's some horrible writing. Let me fix that a little bit. This is the word for death. Okay. Now, what is death in an ancient Hebrew thought process? And I will bring it back to the regular board in a minute, but I want to put that up there first. Okay. Death is not the expiration of the body. Okay. Death is not the expiration of a human's life here on earth. Death is the entire line from the beginning to the end of this thing. Okay. And so you can think of death as that hyphen, if you will, that's on gravestones. Death is everything in between. In other words, by falling into sin, you create a mark on the end of something, not necessarily the expiration of the body. It could be a mark on the end of your blessing. It could be a mark on the end of your sovereignty as a family member, for example, a mother or a father. If you enter into the wrong kind of sin, you actually activate disobedience in your children. We can get into that at another time. Okay, so the principle is that now we have the word death. Well, of course, this is technically called chaos mark. Chaos mark. And like I said, in fact, let me just go ahead and do it now. This is chaos mark here. Chaos mark. Okay. So you could see by removing the aleph, remember we had the aleph here, right? By removing the aleph, we remove the truth and it becomes death. But we also remove what? We remove the original parent root. We remove the mother or the glue. Okay. Now that's going to become important here in a minute. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I guess what I'm going to do here is we will just go ahead and put the aleph in a different color. Okay. We'll put the aleph in a different color here. We're going to put it back in because we don't want death. We want truth. But now remember that this right here is the parent root, not death. Death only becomes a parent root if you remove the aleph. Okay. And so as a result of that, what we need to do is we need to focus on this aleph for a minute, which is what? It's the lead ox. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the lead ox for a minute. Now, you've heard of unequally yoking. You can't put a donkey with an ox, right? Or you can't put a mule with an ox. You have to do an ox and an ox. But what people don't realize is that there is actually a concept that the ancient Hebrews used for training their animals. You would think that the concept would be that you would teach an ox how to drive a line from a young age, and then they would always just be loyal to doing that, right? No, that's not quite how it works. Now, obviously, if this is your first time doing crops, yeah, that's kind of how it works. But the way that they generally would do it is they would get a mature ox, which we would call the lead ox, because what's interesting about a yoke is whatever way that a lead or whatever way an ox is steered and whatever way an ox moves, whoever is the alpha or whoever is the the higher order ox, the other ox will move and steer with that ox out of general respect for the ox. Now they may have figured that out in the yard already. I don't know about that part. But what I do know is when you yoke them together, the lead ox knows the straight line, knows to go the line, knows not to kick against the goads, knows to move in the direction of the person steering it, okay, and does not rebel against that instruction. The younger ox could and would, but won't because of the lead ox. In other words, they are paired together by a sovereign who appoints this one as the subordinate, right? And this one as the authority. But then steers them both. So the concept is basically one of that there's a greater and there's a lesser, and they are to move together as one, right? They're to move together as one. And as they're moving together as one, there is a focus and a movement that is almost perfectly in line with each other, in step with each other. Okay. So the reason why this is important is because basically what we have going on is the lead ox is the Aleph. Okay. A lead ox is the Aleph, meaning what? When we have the Aleph present, it's truth. When we don't, it's death. We got that. But the lead ox is what? Steerable and able to be entrusted with a subordinate. Okay? The lead ox is steerable and able to be trusted with a subordinate, all contained in the letter Aleph. But here's the part that's important about this. Contained in the letter Aleph is the team. Okay? Because remember, the whole idea is that this is going to be to walk a line, to pull a burden, to move together, right? Okay, so contained within the Aleph is the lead ox, but there's no lead ox if there's no subordinate. Because I will remind you of that thought process, right? If we have a general and he has soldiers and they choose to be disobedient to them, what good is his rank? The only way he has rank is if his subordinates, what? Elevate him into the position of general by demonstrating obedience to him. And in demonstrating obedience to him, they're showing themselves to be subordinates, which means what? They are qualifying themselves for what? For rank, right? They're qualifying themselves for what? For blessing and abundance as a result of obedience. Okay? Now, I know that can get a little weird if we start to move in the military side because you don't get much blessing for being a grunt, right? But if we move to the theological side, that starts to really come into play as when you are obedient to an authority and you elevate them to the position they're at, reciprocation will elevate you. Remember, James chapter 4, verse 10, I believe it is, says what? Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will raise you up into a position of honor. Honor is only present if there's somebody to honor you. Therefore, the lead ox is only the lead ox if there's a subordinate, meaning the Aleph contains both oxen. Okay. Why is this important? Well, first of all, obviously, there's the part about being steerable, but there's also the part about being able to pull the load. And there's another part that's what? Able to be responsible, right? Able to respond. Responsible means instead of being reactive to the ox that just won't listen to the driver, you drive that ox who's yoked with you in the direction you're supposed to go. and ignore the complaints, ignore the attempts to kick against the goads, ignore all that, and do what you're supposed to do as a lead ox. That is what we call doing the right thing. Okay? Now, there's a reason for this, and that is the concept of convergence, what we will talk about in a minute. Okay? So there's a principle that once a convergence has occurred, there will be another convergence. Now, sometimes those will serve their purpose and be done, but generally speaking, once a convergence has occurred, then there's probably going to be a revisiting of that convergence. I know that sounds confusing, but we'll get there. Okay, so what do we have within this Aleph that creates truth? We have a team, right? But what else do we have within this Aleph? We have a driver. There's our sovereign, right? The person moving the oxen does not answer to anyone else, but the oxen answer to him. The oxen are pulling a load. They're carrying a burden. That burden is, and that yoke is the choice of the sovereign to move you, or I'm sorry, to move them, the oxen, in the direction that they are supposed to go. The burden does not reflect the authority or the subordination of the two oxen. The burden is the same for both of them. The burden is not different for the immature, disrespectful, kicking against the goads, rebellious heart. The burden is not different for the obedient, response-able, right? Response-able, and what? Self-actualized ox. Okay? Okay. In other words, the burden chosen is the burden chosen. And what's interesting about that is the burden chosen is the result of what? Of sovereignty, not of any other thing. Now, before you think that I am all of a sudden going in the direction of of predestination or going in the direction of the concept of when we just say, oh, well, it's all happening and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's just going to happen that way because of sovereignty, right? Instead, the way that I want you to think about this is that all three pieces of that puzzle are a team. Now, before you start thinking Trinity and getting all weird on me, there's more because there could be up to 6 oxen on a team. And we're going to get to that. Okay, so when we are talking about the process here of the olive, the strength, right? We are moved in the direction of what? The strong mind. We're moved in the direction of what? The mother. We're moved in the direction of the father. We're moved in the direction of the strong stock coming up, and that's that principle of steadfastness or faithfulness. I think there's an irony. No, that's not the right word. I think there is a design to the idea that the mother is the root word of emunah, which is the word for faith in Hebrew. Because faithfulness has a very interesting aspect to it. So let's talk a minute about that, just to touch on it and add that to our repertoire of information about emet, because emet is the root of emunah. Emet is the word truth. So truth is actually the root or the supporting element of the word faith in Hebrew. Okay. So one of the things that you first need to know is that Hebrews do not believe. You probably go, wait a minute, what in the world did you just say? Bear with me. Belief is when you are persuaded and convinced in your mind to accept a a postulation or a argument or a debate about maybe a philosophy or a way of thinking. Okay. Now, the reason why this is important is because that's not faith. Okay. Faith is actually, interestingly enough, an obedience to instruction or a receiving of provision or an acceptance of protection. Faith is banking on truth. So what does truth then become? Truth becomes I will. So now the sovereign or the strength of the tent, that middle pole, now states I will protect you. And the ema, right, the glue that holds the tent together, says I will accept your protection by placing myself in your trust, right? And so now the ema, or the mother principle, or the feminine principle, says I will receive your protection. Remember that the feminine aspect of God is a vessel that is ready to receive and conceive. Okay. And to what? Create something new. But that requires a receiving of that protection, which is what? Comes in the form of an instruction on what to do and how to respond. Okay. So when we're working with this model, the way that I want you to think about this is that an Abba principle asserts protection. I will make sure that you are safe. I will make sure that you are not harmed. I will make sure that you are, that you feel safe. Let's talk about that for a minute. Mainstream Christianity has this sentiment of communication, which basically says God does not care about your emotions. You can't trust your emotions, and your emotions actually cause you to make mistakes, so don't trust them. They are not valid. They are constructs or vain imaginations, and you cannot accept them. And yet we see weird stuff happening in the wilderness. For example, when the Israelites come out of the promised land, or come out of Egypt and enter the wilderness, they bring with them their livestock. Now, I can tell you they did not raise non-kosher animals for their food consumption. Meaning what? They came out of Egypt with their livestock, their oxen, their sheep, their goats, right? And they were able to also potentially hunt other animals in the wilderness, but we won't get into that. But either way, what I'm trying to tell you is they brought food with them, and yet they go into the wilderness and they complain. The people, that's important, complain that they do not have food. Meaning what? They were not willing to part with the livelihood of those animals, because once they were gone, they were gone. And that was part of their investment in their lives. But also the principle was, if we eat them, they're gone. So we need to keep them, perhaps maybe have a couple generations of produced before we eat them. Well, it's interesting because God could have just said, and when I say God, you know that I'm using that so that you understand who I'm talking about, not because I approve of that word. God says, I will rain down food from heaven. I got you covered. Keep your livestock. You don't have to eat them. I got you covered. And he brings quail and he brings manna. Okay. So what's important about that quail and manna is obviously one thing came from heaven, one thing came from earth, but both of them were provision, which brings us to the next element of what? Receiving provision. I will provide for you. The Abba says, I will bring the food to you. I will give you a roof over your head. I will do these things for you. And the vessel of reception takes those things and makes them into something. Okay. The vessel of reception says, okay, I will make this into something amazing. We'll make it into life. Okay. Remember, life is not the non-expiration in the body, but a full belly. Remember, chai has to do with the filling of the belly. And hunger is what? Death. Okay, so in principle, then, that being the case, I will make this house alive. I will fill it with children. I will decorate it and make it a home. And I will cook this food into something consumable, something edible. Now, obviously, we do not have a Torah example of that the woman has to cook all the time. What we do have is we have Esau supposedly preparing an amazing meal for Isaac, enough that he requests it when he wants to bless him. Meaning what? There was both genders cooking. Okay, so don't get into your head that I'm saying that a woman has to cook when the man brings home the food. Not so. Okay. All right. So now we get into instruction. And again, that's the receiving of instruction and making it into something amazing. This is the vessel of reception, interpreting instruction and making it alive, doing something to it. And of course, the principle is that is the idea of there being a cohesive connection between the Abba and the Ima, or the masculine principle and the feminine principle, or the husband and the wife, or the mother and the father. And remember, these are anthropomorphic terms to describe energies that emanate from the intensification of all power in the universe. There's a feminine energy and there is a masculine energy, and then there's a balance between the two of those. There's three connections here. And those three connections have to do with how that dynamic works. A vessel giving, a vessel receiving, and then something amazing resulting. All right. So now when we touch upon this thought process of the vessel of reception, changing the things that come in, not changing them as in restructuring them, but taking what is actually given and doing something with it, right? Okay, so that's awesome and that's pretty cool, but that's not the most important element here. What's the most important element? The most important element is that's how truth and faith activate. What do I mean by this? Well, what is truth? If you think about it, what is truth? Is truth just facts? Not necessarily, right? Because there are times where we perceive something to be fact and it is not fact. In fact, that's why we have a commandment that says, thou shalt not bear false witness. We have a commandment that says, you shall not receive a bribe, right? We have a commandment that says that you will not be impartial, but you will equally distribute justice, abundance, etc. Okay, so in that thought process, then now we have this kind of this area where we have what? We have the outside the fence or outside Torah people being the Gentiles, the Goyim, or the nations. That's how Torah distinguishes between the nation of Israel and the rest of the people. The nations are those who are not the people. Okay. Now, outside that fence, there is no sovereignty of Adam. It says in Hosea that Adam broke the covenant with God. What was the covenant? It was that instruction of sovereignty, okay? When he did not take dominion over the serpent. You can get into that another day, but that's the principle there. Okay, why is this important? Well, I think, first of all, there are two pieces or a two-pronged test that we need to bring into play here, and that is there obedience to Torah or not? Because that separates the people from the nations. However, the people were supposed to be priests, and if you watch my last video, you would understand that a priest is somebody who brings something together, right? And so the whole idea here is that a priest or a Kohen is somebody who is on a higher plane or level than the common people. Common. We shouldn't say common because then we start to get into Acts chapter 10, and God knows that's a fiasco in and of itself, where the Gentile Christians believe that they can eat a forbidden food. Okay, so when we are working with this model, now we get into the model of Israel, where the cycle of Israel, which is the the spring, summer, fall, winter process, or resurrection, maturity, entropy, death. And then there's an idea that if you stay within the obedience, that there's a state of constant resurrection. And that was a whole nother teaching in and of itself. But in this process, the way I want you to think about this is, if you are outside of Torah, you're the nations. That's not outside the camp, outside of Torah. Okay? If Torah's been done away with, you are a Gentile. If Torah hasn't been done away with and you are disobedient to it and you act accordingly, according to Paul, you become uncircumcised and therefore demonstrate that you're outside of Torah. But if you do the things of Torah and you are obedient to Torah, then you demonstrate yourself to be circumcised. Well, what's the circumcision and uncircumcision anyways? It was the promise of Abraham. It's the promise to be in the land. It's the promise of the promised land. Okay? Has nothing to do with Torah in the sense of the mitzvah. 613 commandments, 248 positive, thou shalts, and 365 negative, thou shalt nots. There are plenty of other things that come into play as halakha when we deal with the New Testament, where Paul says, this is the decision I make. And we're going to either respect Paul's decision or we're going to come up with our own. But he was not giving sovereign commandments of God. He was interpreting Torah. And therefore, we can take Paul or we can leave Paul. In principle, then, as we go through this, it is very important to understand that there is a outside the fence, inside the fence mechanism. The inside the fence mechanism has within it this idea of, if you go into the process of flow, you will attract to yourself the rest of those who are flowing. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But for those who are just outside of Torah, this message isn't even for you. If you say you're a Gentile Christian, the law's been done away with, stop the video now. But if you believe that you actually are supposed to walk within the confines of the teaching and instruction of God, then you can continue from this point forward. But what you need to understand is within that, there is a higher and lower. The common people are those who are just do rote obedience to Torah. But the priests have a higher calling, and we've looked at that, right? And the principle is that we're striving to move in the direction of the priesthood. And in that process, we're moving towards the higher self. We're moving towards self-actualization. We're moving towards an internal locus of control. We are finding our way through this thing in such a way that there is a spirit of Torah, that which has been written on our hearts, which is different from the letter, right? Different from what was actually written down. There is a force behind those words. In that thought process, the way I want you to think about this is you have here at the top, love. That's it. Love. Once you start to diminish in divine emanation from the source, all of a sudden we have two commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? Diminishing even more, in other words, as we move more towards the animalistic nature of the mammalian animal that we are, we move into what? We move into self-preservation, connectivity, and reproduction. And in that process, now we have to have more instruction. So it goes from love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. What's the love your neighbor? Well, thou shalt not bear false witness, the commandment to not to commit adultery, murder, stealing, coveting. But then we have 5 commandments that are present in love the Lord your God, right? We have no other gods before me, no graven images, the name, taking the name of God in vain, the Sabbath, and honoring your mother and father. Did I really just do that? Did I put those there? Yes, I'm going to tell you why. Because your mother and father are not your neighbor. And loving your mother and father, or I'm sorry, and honoring your mother and father were not only the priority in Yeshua's mind when he argued with the Pharisees, but also is the 5th commandment. And I believe that the commandments were put in a hierarchy of importance. Okay? And what I mean by that is that each thing has its important connection to the next. What does that mean? That means the 5th commandment is where it belongs, and therefore the number 5, or Hamash, has to do with the 5 fingers wrapping around a sword. In other words, there would be a battle to honor your mother and father. Now, that is only important for one reason, and that is that you need to understand that loving your neighbor as yourself has a higher Torah element to it. When we get into murder and adultery and coveting and stealing and false witness, that's another story. But what we have is we have 5 on this side and 5 on this side. People say, oh, no, that goes, the children honoring the mother and father goes on the other side with love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, fine. I'm not going to argue. But I will tell you that there seems to be a lot of dysfunction in America as a result of the rebellious, obstinate witchcraft heart of a child in response to their mother and father. That definitely plays a role with the heavenly, right? And then we have the earthly, which is it common sense stuff. You're just not supposed to kill, right? Okay. So then dropping down from that, we have the 613, which is, well, if a guy lies in wait for his neighbor or his friend and he kills him, then that's murder. But if he doesn't lie in wait, then that's manslaughter. And we have a city of refuge. Do you see how there's an emanation from love all the way down into Talmud, the lowest level or the lowest interpretation or the fence around Torah? Meaning what? You follow Talmud, you never touch upon breaking the commandments. That was the sentiment of the separatists who formed the group of the Pharisees who had a desire to protect Torah because they didn't want to go into exile again and they wanted released from the oppression of the Greek and Roman empires. Okay, so you can see now how there is a fleshly or ego-driven process in the Talmudic level of Torah. Moving up from Talmud into regular written Torah, the 613, we have a little less inappropriateness of ego. Moving up yet again into the 10 Commandments, we have a higher self, but not a really higher self. But moving up into love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, we have an even higher self. And moving up into love, you don't need instruction. Against such, there is no commandment. Right? So when we talk about faith and we talk about truth, we need to remember that there is a sovereignty to truth. What do I mean by that? Actual truth is instruction or promise. And what's interesting about instruction when it comes to Yahweh is he will always tack a promise on the end of it. He won't say, hey, don't do that. And that's it. He'll say, if you avoid doing this, here's your reward. That's a promise. Now, how do we activate faith? We activate faith by stepping into that promise or instruction, because instruction is just a promise, or instruction is just a task with a promise attached to it. Okay? He never gives you instruction without a promise. And so now, as we move into promise, we understand that faith is actually an activation of that promise. If you will keep the commandments, then these things will happen to you. You will be the head and not the tail. An enemy will attack you one way and flee from you 5 ways. Your kneading bowls will be blessed. Your crops will be blessed. Your children will be blessed. Your wife will be blessed. Your blessings will be blessed. Right? But if you do not, here's another however many curses that will occur. Cursed will be your kneading bowl. Cursed will be your children. Cursed will be this. You will be the tail and not the head. An enemy will attack you one way and you will flee 5 ways. There's a promise attached to instruction. Okay. And so when we activate that, how do we do that? Through obedience. Obedience to what? Obedience to the commandments to equally distribute justice. Social injustice is the core of Torah. Looking out for the widow and orphan is idiomatic for looking out for anybody who can't protect themselves. Okay? It doesn't matter what's going on up here. If you see that somebody is not protected, it is your responsibility to protect them. If you see that there is somebody who's not provided for, it is your responsibility to provide for them. If you see somebody who is without instruction, it is your responsibility to instruct them. Okay, so that builds the foundation for this next part, okay? This next part has to do with the principle of corporate collectiveness, but it also has to do with perseverance. Let me explain. There is a sentiment in the reality of humanity that says that if I do the right thing, I am entitled to be treated good. If I do the right thing, then I am entitled to have justice in my life. If I do the right thing, I am entitled to have a return on investment. Yes and no. The problem is that if you are doing the right thing with a conditional thought process on it, you not only are going to become weary, but you are eventually going to become jaded. There's a few reasons for this. The simplest one is your ego. If you're doing the right thing with an expectation of compensation, you have your reward. That's what Yeshua said. But if you are doing the right thing because it's the right thing, and you are standing up, then you are doing the right thing for the right reason. When it's a no-brainer, when you're not going to ask the question why or who am I giving to, I will tell you, if you begin to open yourself to the belief that the right thing does not require reward, then you will begin to attract to yourself the right thing. What I mean by that is you will be given opportunity to have patience. You will be given opportunity to have joy. You will be given opportunity to have faith. You will be given opportunity to have tolerance. You'll be given the opportunity to love. And in that process, you will attract people who don't have those attributes and need a demonstration of those attributes. I'm going to tell you, I believe that there is a moment in self-actualization where the individual is the priority. What do I mean by that? People will go, toxic human, stay away, because I have become positive. I have positive vibes. I have positive energy, and I do not want you to cause that to diminish. That's okay. It's okay to set those boundaries. It's okay to self-care. But as you're going through life, remember that in general, unless there's a special circumstance, we're going to go through spring, summer, fall, and winter of that thing. So if you come into self-actualization, there will come when there will be a great springing up and becoming. Y'all know that feeling. And any of you who have been self-actualized are like, wow, right? And then there's a maturity. There's a time where it comes into its prime and you're like just this powerhouse with everyone. And then there's a time where it seems like it begins to diminish. And during that time is what? It's time for self-care to begin again. Because if you move into the winter time of that function, you will what? You will move into it unprepared. And if you move into it unprepared, one of the things that's going to happen is you are going to be drained. And in that draining, there will be a death. And that death most likely is going to erase a lot of what you've done. Why? Because that death is going to be a lashing out in resentment to the things that keep trying to draw off you. Because when you were in the summer months of that process, or when you were in the summer of that process, the maturation of that process, the prime, you were just like, just dumping on everybody. And now you're in the winter and people are like still polling. You know, I had an illustration one time and I actually wrote a story. I don't know if I will ever publish it, but I wrote a story about basically this idea of when people bring their burden of need to you, it's this weighted flesh hook that hooks on your skin. And as it pulls down, it drags you down as you continue to move through. Well, when you're in your prime, when you're in your summer of your self-actualization, you're able to carry those things. But in the winter, people will continue to hook on you and you will not have the strength to carry those burdens anymore. That's time for self-care. So what does that mean? There are two things. Obviously, the first one is that you do the right thing for the right reason. But then also there's the principle that in doing the right thing for the right reason, you're going to attract those things that are not right. You are going to attract temples that are in disrepair. Doesn't mean that they're totally dysfunctional. Doesn't mean that they're outside the fence. It just means that they have had a moment of disrepair. That disrepair needs to what? To be repaired by somebody who is in their prime. So the principle is when you're in your winter, most likely somebody's in their prime and they're going to bring that to you. But here's the problem. Most people will see the maturation, will see the summertime as an opportunity to have their ego stroked, as an opportunity to receive all kinds of accolades and blessings and all this other stuff. When the truth is that is the time when you begin to what? See the temples in disrepair and begin to repair them, but also there will be times where you will come into convergence with other self-actualized people. And what is supposed to happen? You all are supposed to unite and become a common unity, a community. So part of the reason for the death side of this thing, part of the reason for the breaking down side of this thing is because we will continue to try to do it in that same strength. When the truth is that we're probably attracting the same frequencies to each other. Grocery store, laundromat, maybe the local, sit and sip, who knows? But the principle is as they come into connection with you, you need to recognize the frequency. And when you do, you need to do everything you can to attract them into your path and become a common unity or a community of self-actualized people. People make the mistake of trying to keep it as an individual. I am self-actualized, so I am stronger and better than the rest of the world, and that's nice if somebody else figures it out, but I have no interest in doing that because I have become the one who's fit. I have become the one who is mentally strong when that's not the case. If this world is going to change, community has to occur. However, that community has to be a renewed institution. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we come together, it cannot be based on tradition. It cannot be based on fundamentals. It has to be based on our frequency. And that means it might not be somebody in your religion. It might not be somebody in your political path. It might not be somebody in your line of business. It could potentially be somebody else, and you just have to accept that they are part of that process. Now, am I telling you that you don't offer them instruction? What did I say before? If somebody needs instruction, you give it. If somebody needs protection, you give it. If somebody needs provision, you give it. You are not giving. Listen, okay. When we talk about the negative reciprocation of something, we need to understand that Torah has placed a governor on it. Remember NASCAR when the cars were just going too fast and they started putting governor plates on the carburetors to keep the car from going any faster than a certain amount or having too much power. There's a governor on negative reciprocation. And what is that? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a one-off. So if you take a peach pit, you plant it in the ground, and in the ground now is that peach pit, it grows into a tree that has a whole bunch of peaches. It's still eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You planted a peach pit, you're going to eat one peach. That's negative reciprocation. That's reaping corruption. Okay. But on the other side, on positive reciprocation, there is 30, 60, 100-fold, which means what? You could even have a 100% return. A 1,000% return. You could literally plant one peach pit and have 1,000 peaches. The principle is that basically the way that you want to think about this is with that when you sow to the spirit, you reap everlasting life. When you sow to the flesh, you reap corruption. When you operate within the ego, you offer the ego its power, its its satiation, then you will reap to the negative. But if you offer into the realm of the spirit or of those energies, then you will have an abundance. What's that abundance for? Can you eat 1,000 peaches? No, you can't. You probably eat 6 before you get a stomach ache. Where do the other 994 peaches go? Out. Out. And if that's true, then what you need to understand is that that was not given to you for you. And if that's the case, then you figure out what your minimum consumption is and distribute the rest. Okay? So, when we're talking about this, the way I want you to think about this is that there's 3 elements to this message. The first one is the obvious, and that is that if you want to walk within the realm of faith, then you need to accept the promises. If he said you'll be the head and not the tail, then you darn well better start being the head. If he said that your enemy would attack you, but it would flee from you 5 ways, then don't start getting weird when you get attacked. He's supposed to flee from you. That's going to happen, right? Those are the promises. And that's how you activate faith. That's how you activate that principle, okay? And so the whole idea is the way in which we keep the olive in the word truth is to be what? To be steerable, to be able to carry the load. So how do you carry a load when you're in your winter? Self-care. You ask for help. How do you carry the load when you're in the fall? Start self-care, right? Realize that it's diminishing. Don't try to create a false illusion where you're trying to hold a fake world together when it's not there. Self-care is necessary. Love your neighbor as yourself. What level are you on if you have to drop down into this 613? You are not on a higher plane there. But when it's love your neighbor as yourself, we are still in that realm. That's like second down from the highest, right? That's an emanation of God that has purpose. And that emanation of God that has purpose, remember I use that word God for your sakes, that emanation, right, is going to be in the realm of how much you operate for yourself in order to maintain the higher self, in order to get back into the springtime where whoosh, there's a resurrection of energy and vibe, and you are able to bring temples that are in disrepair back into repair. Or better yet, create tabernacles, right? Begin to construct new dwelling places of God, new vessels of reception. You know, the other day I helped a homeless guy out, and when I did, I gave him $40, and I said, you cannot spend this money. You need to give this money away, because I had spent a certain amount on him and he had received that 10% of what I had spent on him. I said, that money is not yours. I need you to go and you need to start the cycle. You need to give somebody that $40 so that you can start to walk in abundance and equal distribution. I taught a tabernacle how to become a tabernacle. Okay? So of reception. To what? To equally distribute to others. That principle is going to happen over and over and over again. And the more that you step into it, we're going to begin to attract to ourselves 3 different individuals. The enemy, right? Who wants to what? Bring you into the death state by removing the olive, right? The temples that are in disrepair that need to be repaired, and the contemporary who converges with you in order to what? To become a common unity, a community. And as the community begins to prosper, and as those institutions are available, right, where we have healers, where we have people who can fix minds, where we have people who are able to repair the body, we have people who can provide nutrition advice and all those type of things. And to a community of those kind of people, not preppers, not separatists, but a community of people who are vibing at that level, right? Who are at love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And it doesn't really matter if they call themselves a Jew or a Gentile, but they are operating at that level. Then we start to get into a necessity to allow the individual to come up, right? When I made that man into a tabernacle, okay? When the emanation of God poured into him through me to become something more amazing, he has to go through the individual part first. But instead of moving into the death part, by telling him he needs to go give to someone else, he's starting to form the common unity. He's starting to form the community. This isn't about political sides. This isn't about religious sides. Yeshua spoke to a group of non-believers when he said, "You are the light of the world." What was he trying to tell them? You are the strong minds. Now, granted, his audience was Jewish, but they did not know he was the Messiah, which means that that message is not for believers only. Okay? Now, we can get into doctrinal issues. We can get into interpretations of Torah that would exclude certain people from this process. I already said, if you're not obedient to Torah, you should have turned off the video hours ago or an hour ago. But instead, what we are working with is the thought process of being something amazing that's going to what? Become the change that this world needs. Yes, I have told you in the past, I've told you in the past that it is absolutely necessary that you what? That you start. Why? Because the rest of the world is expecting somebody else to change and expecting somebody else to do the work and blaming everybody else, even though they're the problem. Meaning what? We never get an actual change that the world needs because people are busy trying to get somebody. I'll change when they change. I will, you know what? I will walk better with God when he does. When he stops coming home from work and being a terror to everybody, that's when I'll change. No, you change first and watch what God does. Doing the right thing does not guarantee that you are going to have this puppies and kittens, rose garden, cherries in a bowl life. Right? Doing the right thing activates something in the supernatural realm that is going to definitely reciprocate on you, but you need to understand that it doesn't become an expectation. In other words, do the right thing and all of a sudden everything goes to pot, then that doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing. Because you need to remember two very important things. Number one, you're going to attract to yourself people who need to be repaired, not people who are not. Remember, he came for the sick, not for the healthy. And second is that if your ego expects a reward for the thing that you're doing right, then you have your reward. That's what Yeshua said. And I guess there's a final point that needs to be made on that, and that is that basically what you are working with is a principle of expectation in an imagination. Let me explain what I mean. When you begin to move into to this realm, there are things that you can rightfully expect. You can expect abundance. In fact, if that doesn't happen, if you start tithing and all of a sudden you're in distress financially, I would be having a conversation with God, and it would not be a pleasant one. I would be like, hey, man, you said this. You said to test you. So let's just talk about this for a minute. You're saying to test you. I paid the tithe. You're saying to test you. You're failing the test. So what are we doing here? Either step up or you're not God, right? Isn't that the principle here? He said, test me. Come on, if an individual walks up to you and says, you can trust me, a total stranger, you say, well, how can I trust you? I'll just give you my word. Test me. Okay. So now I trust them to do some task and the task doesn't get done. Well, guess what? They're blowing it. And not only are they ruining the trust, but they are ruining the sense of responsibility in the person. In other words, I'm not going to give them any more responsibilities, right? So when it comes to the intensification of all power in the universe, I think we have a little bit more better track record, right? But also the principle is that you can say, hey, wait a minute, I'm doing this. Either show me what I'm doing wrong, right? Or fix it now, because you said to test you. Come on. This is not something where you go, oh, Lord, if it be your will, I would like to have a return on my investment. No, he said, test me. Test me. And so, in principle, what do we have? We have a time when you are absolutely outside of sovereignty. That's outside of Torah. You don't have any expectations of dominion, don't have any expectations of power, don't have any expectations of collective conscience, don't have any idea that you're going to be in community if you are disobedient to the very core of the intensification of all power in the universe's will. Okay? You're in Torah, but you're just keeping the 613 commandments. You're not adjusting your brain to the fact that you can break a commandment for the preservation of life. And that's a broad interpretation of the law. What I mean by that is what's the preservation of life and what is life, right? There is a whole entire section in Talmud about Lashon Hara, destroying a life as if it's murder. In other words, gossiping about somebody is killing them. Whoa. So a broad interpretation of the preservation of life. And then there's a principle that the temple is the next highest priority. You can break commandments in order to preserve the service of the temple. We won't get into that today because you guys probably have a fit with me because it's Talmudic. All right. So when we are dealing with this, the way I want you to think about this is if you are steerable and you are able to carry the burden, what does that mean? That means self-care is in place, energy's in place, sovereign dominion's in place, right? And you are community minded in this process, you are able to carry the burden. That burden is going to be repairing temples. Okay? That burden is going to be repairing temples. That burden is going to be fixing people, teaching them right. Everything that I have taught you. That's what Yeshua said. Go ye forth, make disciples. What's the first thing you do? You mikvah them. You baptize them. Why? By baptizing them, you are what? Teaching them the difference between clean and unclean. Here's how you change your status. Oh, you touched a dead body. Go wash with water. Change your status, right? Unclean to evening. Why? Because there is actual scientific proof of a diminishing in energy when you touch a dead body. Don't ask me why. I don't got that information. That's above my pay grade, but I know it happens. Same thing with nidah, same thing with emissions, same thing with sicknesses. This isn't rocket science. When somebody is ill, they're not the ones who's going to be going and healing somebody. They need healing, right? So in principle, the way that I want you to think about this is that if you have an expectation that the moment that you become self-actualized, or the moment that you start to realize that he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, you're now the righteousness of God. Thank you, Yeshua, for what? Dying and raising again from the dead. You're now the righteousness of God. What does that mean? You know what? There's a whole lot to that. But the principle is that that's your identity. You're not a mother, you're not a father, you're not a brother, you're not a son, you're not a coworker, you're not an individual. You are a high maintenance child of God, and children of God do God things. Well, guess what a God thing is? Fixing this mess. And if you're fixing this mess, then that means that you need to take care of yourself enough sufficient that you can carry the burden. So if you're able to carry the burden, you're steerable. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to be yoked with an idiot. You're going to be yoked with a goad-kicking, self-reliant, rebellious, disrespectful witchcraft soul. Okay? You're going to be aligned with somebody, you're going to be yoked with somebody who needs to learn the path. And they will be a mess. And I promise you, I'm speaking from experience. I promise you I am. I have friends right now who still believe that Torah has been done away with, and they're a mess. Okay? And I'm not saying I'm not a mess. Because why? Because I still have elevations I need to go through. I still have reciprocations I need to finish up. Right? You have the process of death, burial, and resurrection, but you have the process of that you may have to go through a death in order to be resurrected, in order to have the energy, in order to have the sovereignty, in order to have the dominion. So what happens when you are in a state of disintegration? When you have begun to try to maintain and have created your own reality. And you know these things. Well, interestingly enough, it seems like Yahweh is a little bit harder on those who know, which means what? Your discipline is going to be greater. So what do we need to do? What is the first thing we need to do? We need to love. Okay. Love's great. What does it mean? I'm not quite sure. I think it kind of means like to just send outward, to give, right? To bestow, okay? In the ancient Hebrew, that's kind of the principle. It's a actual physical giving to something, giving to someone who does not have, right? That's the principle. Benevolence. Okay, that's great, but that's a really high emanation. That's somebody who's self-actualized, has an internal locus of control, and does not steal people's energy. Then we go down to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Why are you being told to love the Lord your God instead of just loving? Because why? Because there's a diminishing, there's an assertion of the ego, and there's a diminishing in the power of the emanation. Meaning what? You're corrupted. Because now you have to be told to love God. Really? You have to be told to love the intensification of all power in the universe. Then it says, love your neighbor as yourself. You have to be told to love your neighbor. Who's my neighbor? Well, Yeshua took care of that. It's pretty much anybody, right? Anybody who is in disrepair, anybody who is in need. Now, does that mean that every single last person with a cardboard sign you give money to? No. You will know. There will be an attraction. And you'll know that that's somebody who you're supposed to be aligned with. That's that convergence thing. So in principle, the way that this works is that there is a sovereign plan to converge, but only after you become obedient, which means what? You have a sovereignty. That sovereignty can be what? Controlled throughout your entire life, all the way until you're dead. all the way until your body expires, and you never once step into that place where there starts to be convergences, synchronicity, coincidences. Oh, wow, I was just thinking about looking into the feast days, right? Instead, you will just be in a state of trying to maintain your false realities. And here's the part that sucks. You will hurt someone else. I don't care what you think. You will hurt them. You will hurt them. You will set the wrong boundaries. You will create the wrong limitations in their life, and you will remove their imagination, their aspirations of being amazing. You will kill. You will kill the vision. You will kill the community. So there's a need to move in a direction in which there is now what? Repair, acceptance of proper identity, acceptance of power and dominion. All of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, you'll have energy. Won't know what to do with it, won't know how to use it, but you'll have it. Witness that myself. Okay. I've witnessed it in other people in this congregation, just out of the blue. And next thing you know, they're a spiritual superpower house. I want to remind you that if you are the lead ox, don't think for a second that that makes you somehow important. It doesn't. Because all you're doing is training your replacement. Because when you're dead, he'll be the lead ox. When you were removed out of the situation because you've superseded your potential, right? It's one of the things that trips me out about this whole fruit thing. It always says, behold, man has become like us, knowing good and evil. Therefore, let us block the way to the tree of life, lest he reach out his hand and take and eat and live forever. He exceeded the potential in the garden. And so Yahweh moved him out of the garden. I know that that sounds a little bit off the wall, but the bottom line is when you exceed your potential, you will move on to the next thing. And what's interesting about that is you'll start all over again. You will not be the total sovereign, right? You won't be the main teacher. You won't be the manager. You will be be learning a new path. You will have a different kind of yoke, and you will be learning how to walk that line until that attrition causes that leader to go away and you become the leader and are raised up into a position. And this process will happen over and over and over in your life as you continue to ascend from Talmud into love. From Talmud into the 613, into the 10, into the 2, into the 1. Okay? So, final thoughts. Number 1, why do the right thing? Well, because it's the right thing. No other reason. I don't care how badly you are treated for doing the right thing. Please do the right thing. Don't think you are an island to yourself. Don't think that you're the only one doing the right thing. There are other right thingers out there, and you guys will attract each other. And when you attract each other, you will connect in such a way that there will absolutely be a sovereign convergence where he intended those paths to cross in the first place. Do you know that if you went through your whole life not self-actualizing, not having an internal locus of control, life happening to you, not for you, not stepping into prosperity or abundance, that conversion won't occur. That convergence won't occur. Maybe in a different lifetime, I'm not going to get into that. But what I do know is that convergence won't occur. And so who will miss out? Both individuals who were supposed to meet up. Okay? In that thought process, understand there's a sovereign plan, there's a sovereign intention, but he gave you jurisdiction. And that jurisdiction says you never have to participate in this party. But if you do participate in this party, you can expect a lot of different coincidences and positive energies to come together. Not all of them are going to be pleasant, but do the right thing. The second final thought that we need to get into is this idea of truth, that you activate truth through being that lead ox. If you remove that lead ox from this whole entire process, which means what? You're able to carry the burden and you are obedient enough to the driver that you will go in the direction you're supposed to go. And you're also able to be yoked to a vessel of reception who most likely kicks against the goads, most likely is rebellious and has a witchcraft soul. Okay, so in that thought process, then one last and final thing is that if you are the lead ox, you will be doing the provision, protection, and instruction in some manner. And that provision, protection, instruction is for the weaker vessel, the one that's yoked, okay? Not going to get into the hierarchy of all that. Just understand that that's how that works. That's how Torah does it. But then also you need to understand that if you are the other ox, your heart is probably rebellious. And rebellion is as witchcraft. Therefore, your soul is operating in a malevolent manner until you start to allow the lead ox to pull the yoke in the direction that he wants to go, or in the direction that it wants to go, maybe I should say, because that's the energy moving in that direction, and that will trickle down into a height, width, depth, time state where one human will be over another human. You need to get over that and understand that if you're in a state of reception, whether it's because you're poor, whether it's because you are you're supposed to be the helper or the assistant. Remember, even Elijah had an assistant, but that was his student who would eventually receive a double portion of what Elijah had, making him more powerful than Elijah ever was. But he had to be the subordinate first. He had to be that secondary ox. So don't think I'm only talking about genders here. So in principle, the last thing that we really need to get our minds wrapped around is this idea of sovereignty. I'm going to put it to you this way. You may think that you've got it figured out on what the will of God is. I don't know how many times that I've had the imagination that this is what God wanted me to do, and there were coincidences and there were things going on when really it was something I needed to learn and it was not a good experience. You do not have to have a positive outcome for it to have been sovereign. The serpent in the garden was put there so that Adam could learn to not eat the fruit. The serpent was not put there so that Adam would eat the fruit. It was so that Adam wouldn't eat the fruit. And until he doesn't, that would be you, until he doesn't eat the fruit, serpent's still there. That being the ego, that being the thing that wants to prevent you from being the higher self. You need to overcome that to become the higher self. You need to overcome your ego. And believe you me, I am still in a state of learning how to overcome my ego. Just because I know this stuff, just because I teach it to you, does not make me someone special. You need to know the only difference between me and a malevolent human being is that I stopped hating the world. And when I stopped hating the world and I started to see Yahweh's love for this world, I began to fall in love with this world. And that's when I realized it needed to change. And if it needed to change, who was going to change it? If it needed to change, who was the problem? And I realized it was me. I'm the problem. I am one of the reasons why this world is a mess. And so I'm doing my best to what? Lose the ego and to become self-actualized and to have an internal locus of control. Is it easy? No, it's very difficult because you need to overcome those vain imaginations that were established by wounds and limiting beliefs and a lack of imagination. To become who you're supposed to be, the higher self, you need to alter those things. And those things need to be altered on a voluntary basis. If you're being steered and you're in trouble, then guess what? You're way off the rails of Torah. You're way off the rails of God's teaching and instruction. Okay. So in its simplicity, we need to make sure that the olive stays there, because if it doesn't, then a different parent root is established. Okay? You need to understand that he is in a constant state. And when I say he, I'm saying the intensification of all power in the universe, in a constant state of trying to bring these convergences, because he's trying to build a community of healers, of believers, of whatever. And this hasn't happened since the book of Acts because of ego, because of misinterpretations of scripture, because of making Paul more sovereign than he really was. Okay? Okay. So for those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. And